The air inside the airport terminal was thick with the mixed energy of hurried goodbyes and tired arrivals. It was a familiar symphony of rolling suitcase wheels, muffled announcements, and the constant shuffle of feet moving in 100 different directions. But for those who passed through a certain unmarked door, the world shifted. The chaos faded into a dull hum, replaced by a quiet sense of order. This was the first-class lounge, a bubble of calm before the journey began. And it was from here that a man, looking more like a wandering philosopher than a Hollywood icon, would soon board his flight. He moved through the lounge with a gentle, unassuming grace. He wasn't hiding exactly, but he wasn't drawing attention to himself either. His dark hair was a little unruly, and a day's worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. He wore a simple, well-fitting black jacket over a plain t-shirt, and his jeans looked comfortable, broken in by years of wear rather than designed for fashion. He carried a single, worn backpack slung over one shoulder, its straps softened by use. He was just another person in transit, his face a familiar one that most people couldn't quite place, a phantom from the periphery of their pop culture memory. He accepted a pre-boarding glass of water from the lounge attendant with a soft nod and a quiet, "Thank you," his eyes holding a weariness that went deeper than just a long day. When the call for boarding came, he joined the short, orderly line. There was no fanfare, no special treatment sought or given. He was just another passenger, clutching his boarding pass and waiting his turn. As he stepped onto the plane, the cool, recycled air of the cabin washed over him. The first-class section was a study in muted tones and soft lighting, plush gray seats, polished wood accents, and the low, steady thrum of the auxiliary power unit that promised a swift departure. He found his seat, a window seat towards the front, and began the quiet ritual of settling in. He lifted his backpack into the overhead bin with a soft grunt. His movements economical and careful not to disturb others. He slid into his seat, the plush leather sighing under his weight. For a moment he just sat there, looking out the small round window at the flurry of activity on the tarmac. The baggage handlers, the fuel trucks, the pilots doing their final walk-arounds. It was a dance he had witnessed countless times, a mechanical ballet that always seemed to hold a strange, calming beauty. He let out a long, slow breath, releasing the tension of the day, the week, the months. Here, in this seat, he could finally just be. No one needed anything from him. There were no lines to learn, no cameras pointed at his face, no expectations to meet. There was only the journey ahead. From his backpack he pulled out a book. It wasn't a new, crisp bestseller. It was a worn paperback, its cover creased and its pages softened at the corners from being read and reread. He opened it to a page marked by a folded napkin, his finger finding his place with the ease of long familiarity. As he began to read, his expression softened. The lines around his eyes seemed to relax, and the world outside his small bubble of space began to melt away. A flight attendant passed by, offering him a pre-departure drink. He looked up, his focus gently pulled from his story, and offered her a small, genuine smile. "Just water, please." "Thank you so much," he said, his voice a low, quiet rumble. She smiled back, a warm, unforced expression that she reserved for the passengers who were kind, the ones who saw her as a person and not just part of the service. The calm, however, was a fragile thing. It was shattered by the sharp, unmistakable click of high heels on the polished cabin floor, moving with a purpose that bordered on aggressive. A woman was making her way down the aisle, and her energy was a stark, jarring contrast to the quiet peace that had settled in the cabin. She was dressed in a power suit, the kind that looked expensive and uncomfortable all at once. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, tight bun, and her face was set in an expression of perpetual annoyance. She carried a designer suitcase that was too big for the overhead bin and a large purse that she slung over her arm, its sharp corners bumping into the seats as she passed. She stopped at the row next to the man, her eyes scanning her ticket and then the seat numbers with an air of impatience. With a loud, theatrical sigh, she hefted her suitcase towards the overhead compartment. It was a clumsy, forceful effort. She grunted as she shoved it in, pushing it against the man's backpack with a thud that made the whole bin shudder. He glanced up from his book, a flicker of concern in his eyes, but said nothing. He simply watched as she finally managed to cram the luggage inside, and slammed the door shut with a loud bang that turned a few heads. She then dropped into the aisle seat beside him, her movements sharp and disjointed. She didn't offer a greeting or even a glance in his direction. Instead, she immediately began arranging her belongings around her, pulling out a laptop, a phone, and a bulging file folder, which she slapped onto the fold-out tray table with a loud crack. The scent of her strong, floral perfume suddenly filled the space between them, an overpowering cloud that clashed with the neutral scent of the cabin. She wriggled in her seat, sighing again, this time with a frustrated edge, as if the very act of sitting was a profound inconvenience to her. She then immediately pulled out her phone, her thumb flying across the screen as she typed out a furious message, her face illuminated by the harsh blue light. The quiet bubble the man had so carefully constructed around himself had been popped, replaced by a buzzing, irritating energy that promised a very long flight. He looked back down at his book, trying to find the sentence he had just read, but the words had lost their meaning. The peace was gone. The plane began to move, a slow, gentle push back from the gate that felt final, like a door closing on the solid ground. A soft chime echoed through the cabin, followed by the calm, professional voice of a flight attendant welcoming everyone aboard. The safety demonstration began, a familiar routine of pointing and gesturing that most passengers ignored. The woman beside him certainly did. She huffed loudly, rolling her eyes as the attendant demonstrated how to fasten a seatbelt, as if it were a personal insult to her intelligence. She continued to fidget, pulling at the hem of her suit jacket and tapping her foot with an impatient, staccato rhythm that vibrated through the floor and up the man's leg. He tried to sink deeper into his book, to lose himself in the printed words. The story was a good one, a complex tale of adventure and philosophy, but he found himself reading the same paragraph over and over. The woman's restless energy was a physical force, an invisible static that filled the air between them, making it impossible to concentrate. He could feel her gaze flicker towards him every few seconds, quick, judgmental glances that felt like tiny pinpricks on his skin. He didn't look up. He kept his eyes focused on the page, his breathing slow and even a silent meditation in the face of her storm. As the plane began to taxi towards the runway, the world outside the window became a blur of gray concrete and flashing lights. The increase in engine noise seemed to be the final trigger for the woman, with a sigh that was more like a groan. Of exasperation, she snatched her phone from the tray table. Her movements were sharp and angry. She held the phone not to her ear, but slightly in front of her mouth, her thumb jabbing the screen to put it on speaker. She clearly didn't care who heard her conversation. In fact, it seemed like she wanted everyone to hear it. The call connected, and a voice, tinny and distant, answered on the other end. "You will not believe the day I am having," the woman began, her voice a loud, sharp whisper that cut through the low drone of the engines. First, that meeting was a complete disaster. These people are supposed to be the best in the industry, and they can't even format a simple presentation. I swear I'm surrounded by idiots. She paused, listening for a moment. No, don't even get me started on the flight. It was delayed, of course. And now I'm stuck in first class, and it's not even the nice first class. She shot another venomous glance at the man beside her. He remained perfectly still, a statue carved from patience. He was acutely aware of every word she said, of the way her voice dripped with contempt. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest, an old, unwelcome feeling of being targeted, but he pushed it down. He focused on the feel of the book in his hands, the texture of the worn cover, the weight of the pages. He made a conscious choice to not let her poison his peace. "And the people," she continued, her voice rising slightly. "Oh my God, the people. I'm sitting next to this guy." She said the word guy as if it were something dirty she'd stepped in. He hasn't said a word. He's just sitting there, reading some beat-up old paperback. Who even reads actual books anymore? It's so strange. And he's just sprawling out, taking up all the armrest. It's so inconsiderate. The man's hands, which had been resting loosely on the book, curled into gentle fists for a brief moment before relaxing again. He wasn't sprawling. He was sitting perfectly upright, his shoulders tucked in, trying to take up as little space as possible. Her lie was so blatant, so unnecessary that it was almost impressive. A few rows ahead, an elderly couple turned their heads, their expressions a mixture of surprise and disapproval. A young woman across the aisle, who had been listening to music with one earbud in, slowly put the other one in, her eyes fixed on her phone, a clear signal that she was opting out of the drama. The air in the cabin grew thick with a collective, uncomfortable tension. Everyone was a captive audience to her one-woman show. I wish they'd just screen people before letting them into these cabins, she complained, her voice now loud enough for the flight attendant, who was securing the galley at the front of the plane, to hear. I mean, I pay a fortune for this seat to get away from this. She gestured vaguely in the man's direction, a dismissive wave of her hand. He just looks so sad. It's depressing. I'm trying to have a positive mindset for my meeting tomorrow, and I have to sit next to Eeyore for 5 hours. She let out a short, ugly laugh. The man felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching a scene in a movie. He thought about all the things he could say. He could point out that he wasn't taking the armrest. He could ask her to keep her voice down. He could tell her that her behavior was making everyone around her uncomfortable. But he knew that any response would only feed her fire. It would give her the confrontation she seemed to be craving, so he chose silence. He chose to be a rock, in the middle of her raging river, letting her words flow past him without breaking him. He turned a page in his book, the soft rustle of the paper a tiny, defiant sound in the face of her verbal assault. I have to go, she said finally, her tone filled with theatrical drama. We're about to take off. Pray for me. Seriously, I'll need it. She ended the call and tossed the phone onto her lap with a clatter. She then folded her arms across her chest, a self-satisfied smirk on her face as if she had just won some great victory. She looked around the cabin, daring anyone to meet her gaze. But no one did. The other passengers found sudden, intense interest in their own hands, their own seats, the ceiling of the plane. The silence that followed her tirade was heavy and suffocating. It was the silence of a shared, unspoken judgment. The woman, in her attempt to assert her superiority, had only succeeded in isolating herself, and the quiet man beside her, the target of her scorn, had won a battle she didn't even realize they were fighting, simply by refusing to fight back. The silence that followed her phone call was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful at all, but filled with unspoken words and simmering tension. The woman seemed to feed on this discomfort. She sat rigidly in her seat, her arms still folded, but her eyes were no longer looking for a reaction. Instead, they stared straight ahead, a look of deep, self-inflicted misery etched onto her face. It was as if she had built a cage of her own anger around herself and was now trapped inside it, furious that no one else seemed to want to join her. The quiet man beside her had become a symbol of everything she was fighting against. Calm, contentment. A world that didn't revolve around her immediate gratification. The plane's engines began to whine. A high-pitched, powerful sound that grew steadily louder. The large aircraft started to move, taxiing towards the runway with a slow, lumbering purpose. The gentle sway of the cabin seemed to annoy the woman even more. With each small bump, she would let out a sharp, audible puff of air, as if the ground itself was personally conspiring to ruin her day. She pulled a sleek, silver laptop from her bulging file folder and slapped it onto the tray table, the sound echoing in the tense quiet. She opened it with a sharp click, the bright screen illuminating her stern face. But she didn't type. She just stared at it, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, her jaw clenched. She was a predator who had lost her prey, and the lack of a fight was leaving her restless. The man, for his part, had managed to retreat back into his book. The words were starting to make sense again, forming sentences and paragraphs that created a world far away from this cramped, hostile space. He was a traveler in more ways than one. He journeyed through pages, through characters and ideas as a way to navigate the world. It was a skill he had honed over a lifetime, a portable sanctuary he could build around himself wherever he went. But the walls of this sanctuary were being constantly tested as the plane turned onto the runway and paused. A moment of anticipation hung in the air. The engines roared to life, a deafening, full-throated thunder that shook the entire cabin. This was it. The final push before the leap into the air. And it was in this moment of maximum noise and vibration that the woman chose to escalate her campaign of disrespect. She suddenly decided she needed something from her purse, which was wedged tightly between her feet and the wall of the cabin. Instead of asking him to move his legs or waiting for the plane to be in the air, she began a series of violent, jerky movements. Twisting and contorting in her seat to reach the bag, her sharp elbow jabbed into his side, not once but twice. It wasn't an accidental bump. It was a pointed, aggressive act. The first time he flinched, a reflex he couldn't control. He shifted his leg, giving her more room, a silent gesture of accommodation. But it wasn't enough. She grunted with effort, a sound of pure frustration, and shoved her entire body against his, digging her bony shoulder into his arm as she fumbled with the zipper of her purse. He could feel the tension in her muscles, the sheer force of her will being exerted against him. He pressed himself closer to the window, trying to become as flat as possible, a human pancake against the cold glass. He could feel the eyes of the passenger across the aisle on them, a look of shocked sympathy directed his way. Just then, the plane began its rapid acceleration down the runway. The force pressed them both back into their seats, a powerful, undeniable weight. For a few seconds they were locked together, a forced and uncomfortable intimacy born of her aggression and the physics of flight. He could feel her expensive, scratchy suit jacket against his arm, could smell the overpowering scent of her perfume mixed with the faint, stale air of the cabin. He closed his eyes, not in defeat, but as a way to escape the sensory overload. He focused on the feeling of the plane, the incredible power of it lifting off the ground, the brief, stomach-lurching moment of weightlessness as the wheels left the runway. He thought of the vast, open sky above them, a boundless space of freedom, a stark contrast to the tiny, cramped bubble of hostility he was trapped in. The woman finally yanked a small bottle of hand sanitizer from her purse with a triumphant little grunt. She pulled away from him, the sudden release of pressure almost as jarring as the initial contact. She didn't say a word. There was no, "Excuse me," no, "Sorry," no acknowledgement of the physical discomfort she had just caused. She simply unscrewed the cap and vigorously rubbed the gel onto her hands, the sharp, antiseptic smell cutting through the air. It was a final, dismissive act, as if she were trying to wash away the very experience of sitting next to him. The plane continued to climb, angling steeply into the clouds. The man opened his eyes and looked out the window. The world below was shrinking, the familiar grid of streets and houses transforming into an abstract pattern of light and shadow. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching the scene from a great height. The woman's anger, her impatience, her rudeness, it all seemed so small and insignificant from up here. It was a tempest in a teacup, a storm in a thimble. He felt a pang of pity for her. To be so unhappy, so constantly at war with the world, must be an exhausting way to live. He turned his gaze back to his book, but he didn't read. He just held it in his hands, a familiar and comforting weight. The battle for the armrest, for the shared space, was over. She had claimed her victory with brute force. But as the plane soared higher, leaving the world behind, he felt like the one who was truly free. The seatbelt sign remained on, a silent, glowing reminder that they were still trapped together, but the peak of her disrespect had passed. What remained was the quiet, heavy aftermath, and the unspoken question of what would happen when they were finally free to move. The plane climbed steadily, leaving the patchwork of city lights far below, until it was suspended in a world of darkness and distant stars. The powerful roar of the engines softened to a steady, comforting hum, a constant vibration that was the only sign of their incredible speed. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere remained tense, a fragile truce after the physical and verbal assault of takeoff. The woman sat stiffly, her anger still simmering just beneath the surface. She had won her small, petty battle for space, but it brought her no satisfaction. The man beside her remained a silent, infuriating monument to calm, his presence a constant, quiet judgment on her turmoil. After a few minutes, the captain's voice crackled through the speakers, announcing they had reached their cruising altitude. A soft, two-tone chime followed, and the illuminated seatbelt sign above them clicked off. This was the signal. The cabin was now open for business. Almost immediately, a flight attendant appeared at the front of the aisle, pushing a silver cart laden with drinks and snacks. She moved with an easy, practiced grace, her smile warm and genuine as she approached the first row. The woman watched her approach with a critical eye, already preparing her order in her head, something specific and complicated to reassert her sense of importance. But the attendant stopped at their row first, her attention focused entirely on the man in the window seat. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Can I get you anything to drink? Perhaps a sparkling water, or maybe a soda?" The man looked up from his book, marking his page with a finger. He offered the flight attendant the same small, gentle smile he had given her before boarding. "Just a still water, please." "Thank you so much," he replied, his voice low and polite. "Of course," the attendant said, her own smile widening slightly. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a brief moment of starstruck surprise that she quickly masked with professionalism. But it was there. She poured the water into a glass with a slice of lemon, placed it on a napkin, and handed it to him with a deference that went beyond standard first-class service. "Here you are. Let me know if you need anything else at all." "Anything at all?" The woman observed this exchange with a growing sense of irritation. Who was this guy to get such special treatment? He looked like a slob in his worn jacket and t-shirt. She opened her mouth to complain, to ask the attendant why she hadn't been served first, but the attendant was already turning to her, her professional smile snapping back into place. "And for you, ma'am?" The woman's annoyance got the better of her. "I'll have a club soda." "With lime?" "And make sure it's not flat," she said, her tone sharp and demanding. The attendant's smile didn't falter, but a hint of frost entered her eyes. "I'll see what I can do," she said evenly. Before moving on to the next row, the woman huffed, turning her head to glare at the man beside her, ready to silently blame him for the attendant's perceived slight. But this time, when she looked at him, something was different. The soft cabin lighting hit his face at a new angle as he turned to take a sip of his water. And for the first time, she wasn't looking at a generic, sad guy. She was looking at a face she had seen 100 times before, on giant screens in dark rooms, on magazine covers in the grocery store checkout line. The features she had carelessly dismissed as strange suddenly snapped into horrifying focus. The strong nose, the full lower lip, the soulful, tired eyes that held a depth of melancholy she had mistaken for depression. The dark hair that fell across his forehead in a familiar, unruly way. It was like a puzzle piece clicking into place in her mind with the force of a thunderclap. The memory of a movie poster, a scene from an action film, a talk show interview, it all flooded her brain at once. Oh my God, the thought didn't form as words, but as a cold, sickening wave that washed over her. The blood drained from her face, leaving her feeling lightheaded and dizzy. A hot flush of shame immediately followed, burning her cheeks and the back of her neck. Her heart began to pound against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird beating to get out. Her own voice echoed in her head, a recording of every cruel, stupid word she had spoken. Asterisk, I'm sitting next to this guy. He just looks so sad. It's depressing. I wish they'd just screen people before letting them into these cabins. Asterisk, each phrase was a fresh stab of humiliation. She remembered jabbing her elbow into his side, shoving her shoulder against his, treating him like an inanimate object in her path. She had complained about him to her friend, to the entire cabin, painting him as a pathetic, inconsiderate loser. And the whole time she had been verbally and physically assaulting one of the most famous and famously kind actors in the world. The silence between them was no longer just tense. It was an abyss, a chasm of her own making. She was trapped in a metal tube miles above the earth, sealed into a small seat next to the living embodiment of her own awful behavior. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. She could only sit there, drowning in her own regret. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her. She wanted to turn back time, just 10 minutes, and be a decent human being. But time only moved forward, and she was stuck with the consequences. She could feel his presence beside her, not as a threat, but as a quiet, steady witness to her downfall. He hadn't changed. He was still just a man sitting in a seat reading his book. But her perception of him had been so violently rewritten that the air itself seemed to have changed. The scent of his simple soap, the quiet sound of his breathing, it all felt magnified. Accusatory. She had to say something. The silence was unbearable. But what could she possibly say? Sorry, I was a horrible person for the last hour. I didn't realize you were famous. That would only make it worse. She fumbled for words, her mouth dry, her tongue feeling thick and useless. She opened her mouth, but only a small, choked sound came out, and then he moved. He turned his head slowly and looked at her. There was no anger in his eyes, no smugness. No, I told you so. There was only a gentle, almost apologetic concern. He had seen her distress. He had witnessed her entire, silent meltdown. And his first instinct was to worry about her. He leaned slightly towards her, his voice a low, soft rumble that was somehow louder than a shout in the thick silence. Are you all right? He asked. You look a little pale. That was it. That was the moment that broke her. The simple, human kindness in his question, the complete lack of judgment, was more than she could bear. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, her hand trembling. She stammered, her voice a hoarse whisper. I am so sorry. I didn't realize who you were. The words came out in a rush, a pathetic, jumbled confession. I was so rude. I'm so sorry. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable but not unkind. Then he offered that small, sad, beautiful smile. It wasn't a smile of forgiveness, exactly, but of understanding. It was a smile that acknowledged her flawed humanity without condoning her behavior. It's all right, he said softly, his voice carrying a weight of grace that felt immense. Really, it's a long day. No worries. He gave a slight, final nod and then turned his gaze back to his window, giving her the space to process her crushing, all-consuming embarrassment. He didn't gloat. He didn't lecture. He didn't make a big deal out of it. He simply let her off the hook. And in that moment, his quiet act of forgiveness was far more powerful than any confrontation could have ever been. He had shown her more kindness in 30 seconds than she had shown anyone, including herself, in the last hour. And she was left to sit with that, a prisoner in her seat, with over 3 hours of flight time left to go. The words hung in the air between them, not just sounds, but something tangible, something solid. It's all right. No worries. They were so simple, so small, yet they carried the weight of an entire universe of grace. He turned his head back to the window, a final, quiet dismissal of the entire, ugly incident. He was done with it. He had let it go. But for her, it was just beginning. The shame that had flooded her now crystallized into a sharp, heavy thing inside her chest. She felt like she was shrinking, collapsing in on herself, becoming smaller and smaller in her seat. The plush leather of the first-class cabin, which had felt like a throne of entitlement just an hour ago, now felt like a witness stand, and she was on trial. With a jury of one sitting silently beside her, she didn't dare look at him again. Instead, she stared at the back of the seat in front of her, her vision blurring. The pattern on the fabric swam in and out of focus. She could feel the silent judgment of the other passengers who had heard her tirade. She imagined them all looking at her, thinking what a horrible, shallow person she was. And they were right. The thought was a bitter pill. She had built her entire sense of self on a foundation of superiority, on the belief that her status, her suit, her frantic schedule made her more important than others. And in one quiet, devastating moment, a man in a worn t-shirt had dismantled that entire foundation. Not with anger, but with kindness. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Minutes felt like hours. The steady hum of the engines was a constant reminder that she was trapped, a captive in her own personal prison of regret. She tried to focus on her laptop to open the presentation she was supposed to be rehearsing, but the words and figures were just meaningless shapes. Her mind kept replaying the scene, her own shrill voice, the casual cruelty of her words, the jab of her elbow. And then his face. The look in his eyes when he asked if she was all right. It wasn't pity. It was genuine concern. That was the part that tortured her the most. He hadn't seen an enemy. He had seen a human being in distress, and he had responded with compassion after what felt like an eternity. The flight attendant with the warm smile came back down the aisle, this time to collect the empty glasses. When she reached their row, she paused. She looked at the woman's untouched club soda, the lime still floating on top. Then she looked at the man's empty water glass. "Can I get you another water, sir?" she asked, her voice filled with that same unexplained deference. "No, thank you. I'm all set," he replied, glancing up from his book with a small smile. "But I appreciate it." The attendant nodded, a look of genuine warmth on her face. "You just let us know if you need anything at all." She took his glass and then, almost as an afterthought, picked up the woman's full club soda without a word. The subtle difference in her treatment was a final, damning piece of evidence for the woman. It wasn't just her. Everyone else saw it too. This man had an aura about him, a quiet goodness that was recognizable even to strangers. And she had attacked it. A little later, the man shifted in his seat. He closed his book, placing his napkin carefully inside to mark his page. He then turned to her, and her heart leaped into her throat. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice just above a whisper. "I'm just going to use the lavatory." The woman practically vaulted out of her seat, scrambling to get into the aisle, her movements clumsy and frantic. "Oh, of course." "Yes, sorry." "So sorry?" she stammered, pressing herself against the seats opposite to give him as much room as possible. She felt like a clumsy child, desperate to make amends for her earlier behavior. He moved past her with an easy grace, his body not even brushing against hers. "Thank you," he said simply, as he made his way down the aisle. While he was gone, she sank back into her seat, her hands trembling. She took a deep, shaky breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. She looked at his worn book on the seat, at his folded-up jacket on the armrest. They were just objects, but they felt like artifacts from a different world. A world where people were kind and patient and didn't feel the need to announce their own importance to everyone around them. She realized she wasn't just sorry she had been rude to a famous person. She was sorry she had been a rude person, full stop. He was just the catalyst who had made her see it when he returned. She repeated her frantic performance, practically throwing herself into her seat to get out of his way. He offered another quiet, "Thank you," and settled back in, picking up his book as if nothing had happened. The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer filled with her tension, but with a strange, new kind of peace. It was the peace of a lesson learned. However painfully, the captain's voice soon announced they were beginning their descent into New York. The plane started to drop, the clouds outside the window thinning to reveal a glittering grid of lights below. The city was getting closer, and with it, the end of this unforgettable, life-altering flight. As the plane landed with a series of bumps and the roar of reverse thrust, the woman felt a sense of finality. This was it. Her time in this classroom at 30,000 feet was almost over when the seatbelt sign clicked off and the aisle began to fill with people grabbing their bags. He didn't move. He just sat there, patiently waiting for the rush to subside. She waited too, not wanting to cause another scene by pushing past him. Finally, when the aisle was clear, he stood up and retrieved his backpack from the overhead bin. He then turned to her, and for the first time, she looked directly at him. Her eyes filled with a remorse so deep it felt like it could swallow her. I want to say again how truly sorry I am," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." He looked at her, his expression soft and open. He didn't smile, but his eyes were kind. "We all have our days," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "It's forgotten. Have a good night." He then turned and walked down the aisle, disappearing into the crowd of passengers deplaning. She sat there for a moment, his words echoing in her mind. It's forgotten. It was a complete and total absolution. He wasn't just letting her off the hook. He was erasing the debt. She slowly gathered her things, her movements now calm and deliberate. As she walked through the terminal and out into the cool night air of the city, she felt different. The frantic, angry energy was gone, replaced by a quiet hum of humility. She didn't just meet a movie star on that flight. She had a brief, profound encounter with true class, and it had changed her in a way she knew she would never forget.